Now that we've got the extremes down, we know perfect competition. We know, so remember, that's a lot of firms. Everybody's selling the same product, perfect information, can't move your price, and highly competitive environment. And we know monopolies, pure monopolies, one firm, no competition, market power, etc. Now we're going to look at the stuff that lies kind of in between. Monopolistic competition is kind of a perfect in-betweener. It actually has the name monopoly, as you see, monopolistic, but it also has the word competition. Competition works because you have a bunch of sellers again. Just like perfect competition, we're dealing with many firms. And it doesn't matter what many is, as long as it's enough firms to where no one firm is going to be able to really change things all by themselves. You have to be aware of what your competitors, you have competitors, and you don't want to chase your customers away to your competitors. But we no longer have a homogeneous product. It's a differentiated product. It's kind of obvious what that means, but there are some less obvious ways of differentiating a product that we'll get into. But it is no longer the case that you can go next door and get the exact same thing. But it's also not like with Monopoly to where you have no close substitutes. A differentiated product has close substitutes. A close substitute is something where you would be willing to pay a little bit more money for a preferred product, but not that much more, just a little bit more. So the products are largely the same and provide a similar amount of utility, but there's more utility to be had from one product over the other. So you decide if you want more utility or if you want to save your money, and obviously marginal utility per dollar spent, right? Remember, that's how you figure out what the best way is to do things. And then remember, the third characteristic we looked at had to do with firms to entry. There are a large number of sellers, so you ought to be able to guess that it's pretty easy to get in and out of the market. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a lot of sellers. And again, we make assumptions. Once again, this is usually in most market structures, unless you're absolutely going to look at a situation where you will expect overproduction or underproduction in a lot of cases. There are other modeling contexts beyond this class that deal with that sort of thing. But if you're not specifically looking at that, the model usually works best and can be dealt with and understood best if you assume the market's clear at the market price. Even if it's not perfectly realistic, again, it's an assumption we make without losing generality. In monopolistic competition, you have some market power, and I already described that. Remember, market power simply means that you don't have to charge marginal costs. You don't have to charge exactly what the market is charging. You may be able to differentiate your product just enough to where you know that enough of your consumers will buy from you, even if they know they can get something similar for less. So you have some flexibility to raise and lower your price a little bit. Not as much as with Monopoly, but you do have some market power. Not as much in general anyway. But now we are back to a more perfect competition type of thing. Short-run economic profits can happen in perfect competition and in monopolistic competition. They are not inevitable. It is easy to think that with both monopoly and something that has the word monopolistic in it, but they're not inevitable. It can happen. But in the long run, we're going to be right back to normal profit, and we're going to see why when we get to that. Finally, remember that perceived demand curve. In perfect competition, it's the same downward sloping curve in the market, but the perceived demand curve is perfectly flat. It's infinitely elastic. With monopoly, the market and perceived demand curve are the same because the monopolist is the market. In monopolistic competition, we're going to look at a market filled with people who will go to markets that are similar enough to where you can almost think of them as being in the same market. So the market demand curve, it has nothing to do with the cost structure and everything to do with different willingnesses to pay for different people and different quantities demanded at different prices. The perceived demand curve is not the market demand curve anymore. It's a downward sloping curve, though. It's not infinitely elastic. Because remember, with perfect competition, you have no market power. You move your price by 1 penny. You raise it by 1 cent. All of your customers are gone. You will not sell a single unit. With monopolistic competition, you can raise it a little bit. And you might lose a little bit of business, but you'll still be able to sell some units. So it's somewhere in between the monopolist perceived demand curve and the perfect competitor's perceived demand curve. It's not perfectly flat, but it's not the market curve either. It's more inelastic than the perfect competitor's curve, but more elastic than the monopolist's curve. So remember the monopolist, this is the market and demand curve. And of course, the marginal revenue curve is down there. This is what the perceived demand curve looks for the monopolistic competitor. This here is still the market demand curve, but this is the curve that the monopolistic competitor sees. For the monopolist, you're the only firm in town. This is your demand curve. You will sell whatever you produce at the maximum willingness to pay. But the monopolistic competitor, you lower your price a little bit, you'll sell a little more. You raise your price a little bit, you'll sell a little less. But you don't lose the entire market. But there are people who might have a willingness to pay above that higher price that you're charging, but it's still not a low enough price for them to be willing to accept a slight reduction in utility by going to one of your competitors. And again, the marginal revenue curve lies below the perceived demand curve, just as in monopoly, but you see that they flatten a little bit because it's no longer the market demand curve. So just to compare here, you can have the same situation here. This is the optimal quantity and price. They can overlap here. But if the price goes up, the monopolist can raise it all the way and drop their quantity all the way, but the monopolistic competitor is going to have to drop their quantity more if they're going to charge that same price. And go in the other direction at a lower price, you compare the monopolist, their increase in quantity is going to be smaller than the monopolistic competitor. It's just one of the features of having that flatter curve. So let's talk a little bit about differentiating a product. Obviously, having a slightly different flavor of food, like Taco John's versus Taco Bell. They're both tacos, but they taste a little bit different. But there are other ways to differentiate a product. You can have different customer service. We used to have Time Warner Cable when we were living in New York, and we hated their customer service. When we found out that we could get Verizon Fios, we loved their customer service. So that's one small difference that I actually don't remember if we paid more for Fios, but we might have been willing to. Just a little bit more, not much. Other ways to differentiate a product. I don't know if any of you have ever done a focus group. I remember I did a focus group back in college, a little extra money, and I was given various different tubes to dispense some sort of paste, probably toothpaste, just given the way it was formed. And you have the little twist off cap for some toothpaste, and others you have the cap that you could just flip up. You get a lot of toothpaste under that cap and it gets gummed up a little bit. Not as much of a problem with the twist off thing, but you're more likely to lose that cap. There are a lot of different ways where different packaging can be more or less attractive, enough to where that's a way in which you can differentiate a product. So it goes beyond slightly different flavors or colors or something like that. Also branding. If you know you can trust a brand, then you might prefer that brand over something else. And of course, just associating things with a celebrity. I remember when I was a kid, it was all about Michael Jordan. I didn't want to drink all sport. That's Shaq's thing. I like Shaq okay, but Gatorade, that's Michael Jordan's drink, so by goodness, that's my sports drink too. A little ridiculous when you think about it, but things play in our subconscious and branding makes a difference. So there's just a few examples of how you might differentiate a product. So you're selling a similar thing, but it's not exactly the same. But it's close. And it's close enough to where big price changes are going to have big changes in quantities demanded. But they're different enough to where small price changes, you might actually be better off raising your price a little bit because there won't be that much of a drop in demand. Now, when answering the questions that we're going to keep asking, pricing and quantity decisions, we get those from graphs. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's always going to be there. That is where your optimal quantity is. So we throw the cost curves in here. We've got the marginal cost curve here. Intersects with marginal revenue here. This is your optimal quantity. Perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition. This is always going to be your optimal quantity. And then the price is going to be the highest price that the market will bear. So this is going to look very much the same. And notice what we have, a price above average total cost. What do you think is going to go here? That's your economic profit. This is in the short run. Before we get to that, let's look at a case where average total, well, no, this is actually the long run. So let's go back here. In the short run, you're earning economic profit, but remember, there are low barriers to entry. You can make a largely similar thing, but differentiate it just a little bit and get customers to come to you instead. So what's going to happen is that demand curve is going to shift to the left, and you're going to have a situation here. If it shifts all the way down here, then firms are going to exit, and then it'll shift back to the right. This is where we're going to be in the long run. Price is equal to average total cost, and economic profit is eliminated, and you have normal profit. And of course, this slide reminds us that average total costs can be above the market demand curve. These two are not related. It doesn't matter what market you're in. Costs may just be too high for you to function in this market in the long run. In the short run, you're above average variable cost, so you may still sell here, but you're going to lose money on those sales. So again, profits are not inevitable in the short run, but they are possible in the short run, but not in the long run. So another thing to look at. Monopolistic competition has deadweight loss. And it has that. Let's go back to this slide, the long run slide. You still see, remember this marginal cost curve is the supply curve. You still have a little bit of deadweight loss in here. And that is because your optimal production, marginal cost equals marginal revenue, happens at a point that is below marginal cost being equal to the price that society is willing to pay. So you're not productively efficient because you have, and you're not allocatively efficient because you have some deadweight loss in there. Even when you get to normal profits, the demand curve shifting less, you're still not going to get as much in the market as can be had with marginal costs. So why this is maybe the most common market structure out there. Why might it be okay to have monopolistic competition? Well, here's why. And that speaks for itself. So thank you for watching the video, and memorize this for the exam. I'm not serious. Of course. This is the fancy way of saying that people like variety. You may have heard me croon on about Joseph Stiglitz here and how he should have maybe 3 Nobel Prizes in economics, but he's only allowed to have 1, and he had to split it with a bunch of people. Fine, whatever. This is one of his innovations that I think is kind of cool. This is a utility function. I've talked about how economics always comes back to why do we care if we're not going to make people happy, allow people to have a good life? The more utility you have, the better your life is essentially how utility works. So we want to maximize the utility function. And this is set up, this is an integral here, which means summing over continuous space. The y here, this is output, but the i's, theta is all the different variety. These sigmas here, sigma minus 1 over sigma, and then on the outside here, you have it flipped. Those are elasticity of substitution parameters. Of course, you know that. Okay, you don't need to know anything about this. All this is really saying is that people like variety. And again, a lot of us can look into our personal life and consumption habits. You get tired of one thing, so you go for another. Obviously with food, but maybe you've been watching a lot of comedies lately, and you want to go see an action or a drama or an epic or something like that. We want different things. Intelligent human beings, contrary to what some people might say, we are all intelligent. We like to be challenged. We like to mix things up. So our utility is better maximized with variety, even if we accept a little bit of an allocatively inefficient way of doing things. If we assume that people's utility functions look like this is Dixit, Stiglitz, this model basically says that variety makes monopolistic competition possibly okay.